Livescope and swimbaits, they have been really going hand in hand in recent years from tournament guys like the Ben Millikins, as well as just the normal just swimbait guys from local guys to California to Texas to the south to the north. Swimbait fishing with Livescope has definitely become a very popular thing. I mean, not just using Livescope with swimbaits, but just Livescope in general. And there's been a massive buzz around Livescope, and it hasn't been this kind of buzz and drama in the fishing community really since like the A-rig came around, where there was a bunch of people saying that the A-rig was the cheater rig and it should be banned here, should be banned there. So Livescope has been a very hot topic recently, but I'm not gonna really talk about live scoping and tournaments. That doesn't really revolve around me. Obviously, I don't really care. But live scopes and swim baits, and I wanted today to talk about the benefits of live scope as well as what I think could be detrimental to just fishing as a whole further down the line. So, to give some context, I personally don't have live scope on the tin boat, but I've used it when I went fishing with my buddy Matt out in Virginia. I got to use it really hands-on for like the first time for a few hours. I've had plenty of other buddies have used it, from tournament guys to swimbait guys, from all over the place. And I've always asked them questions about, how has your success been out on the water with live scope, without live scope? What are the positives and the negatives of using live scopes? And mostly everybody has kind of the same quarrels with it, where it's like, oh, it does this amazingly, but we've also seen this effect on the fish or the pressure and so on and so forth. I'm generally just speaking how from a guy that's kind of neutral about Livescope will have a take on it. I don't hate Livescope. I also don't love it. I'm kind of just in the middle of like, I can see it being just another tool to use, kind of how like when SideScan came out, a lot of people thought that was cheating as well. I mean, when SideScan came out, it was absolutely revolutionary. I mostly just use SideScan, and every day that I use it, I still think like, this is the greatest thing that in fishing history. I mean, I can see contours and I can see rock piles, trees and stuff like that, 100 feet to the left, 100 feet to the right. It just made fishing so much easier to find fish and find structures before. And we're seeing the same thing now with Livescope. Livescope is just the next advancement in the fishing world that makes fishing a lot easier for guys to find fish and understand fish and stuff like that. It's a massive jump going from SideScan to Livescope now, to where you can actively see fish chasing your lure or chasing bait or just sitting, suspending, doing just behavior that we weren't really able to really notice before without Livescope. So there's a huge plus in that, where now we can kind of see, all right, what are fish actually doing when our minds and our brains always told us that they were doing this? So I think being able to figure out what the fish are doing without having to put in years and years of time and research on just one single body of water to kind of even understand fishing. Out here in Arizona, I mainly fish 2 or 3 lakes, and those 2 or 3 lakes, really 2 of them, I've fished for basically a decade now, and I've gone through the ringer with them, and I've had basically the luxury that almost every single week that I'm in this state, I can fish those lakes 2 to 3 times a week. For a lot of those guys that like to go out and go fishing, a lot of them just don't have the same luxuries as I do that are able to fish that much. I mean, some guys are only fishing once a month, twice a month, if they're lucky, because they have other things going on in life. For me, I was just able to just bang my head into a wall and put years and years of time on the water, on those bodies of water, to kind of even start to like figure out like, all right, this is what the fish do with this and that conditions and this and that, but that took years and years. So a great positive for Livescope is, of course, those guys that aren't able to get out as much they're able to still at least catch fish. And catching fish is what drives, obviously, the sport of bass fishing, is people need to catch fish or people won't go bass fishing. And so if people are able to go out that once or twice a month and utilize Livescope to help them catch their few fish every, twice a month, that's such a huge positive because it just helps. I mean, you always want everybody to catch fish if it's possible. Now, the negative to that is basically everybody is starting to use Livescope all of the time. I mean, just in my past few recent trips, I just started to notice the number of people that have Livescope went from 30% of guys, maybe up to 70% of the boats out on the water are using Livescope, which kind of the biggest thing for me is what are the effects that Livescope will have on the fish over time. Yes, we are catching them now on Livescope, but I can't even imagine the signal that's being put off by Livescope hitting those fish constantly instead of like a 2D sonar where, it hit them, but it was kind of secluded. But now you can hit a fish, follow that fish, hit it again, and keep hitting it. And I'm just curious on psychologically and maybe deeper in the genes and genetics of a fish, will they finally associate Livescope with something being bad, like a bad thing? And I've always chalked that up as fish, they instinctively know that if there's a shadow that kind of flies over their head, that means danger. It's probably a bird, and a bird of prey that will probably try and kill the fish. Or if there is a bird standing on the shoreline, they know, don't go near that, it's gonna kill us. They instinctively know that. And I'm just curious on if bass will instinctively figure out this Livescope stuff, this whatever this thing is that keeps hitting us, and then we accidentally get caught by one of those human alien things, this is gonna be a thing that hurts fishing. So where I would love to do that kind of case study is obviously on the legendary OHIV, where that lake has been absolutely getting pounded for the past few years now. And most, if not every boat that goes out on that lake is using Livescope. And guys are catching giant bass because of Livescope. A lot of those guys are fishing for fish that honestly would be very, very hard to catch without Livescope. And those fish, when they're caught, they go through a very traumatic period of where it's whoa, this has never happened to us. Normally we're safe out here. Then they get caught. Then if they are teener or bigger, those really giant fish, they are taken from wherever they're caught, put in a live well, driven across the lake, put in basically that store where they weigh the fish. Then Game and Fish comes out, they take the fish and they go breed it. I'm curious on if that has an everlasting effect on the fish of this whole traumatic ordeal. And it reminds me of some of the abduction stories that you hear, about aliens abducting people and they kind of just vanish, right? And then they come back and they're like, yo, they took my sperm and they did a bunch of weird stuff to me, and then I kind of just came back. It's weird how bass fishing and alien abductions are actually semi-close when you hear the stories, but it's stuff like that where there's a dramatic feel to that. So I'm curious on if in long term, when those fish spawn and they take those hatchlings and they put them back in OHIV, I'm curious on if those hatchlings will have an instinct to know hey, whatever that thing that's hitting our lateral line in our bodies, that's a bad thing. We're not gonna eat. We're just gonna shut down. I'm curious on if that will happen. And I've talked to, like I said, a lot of different guys that have been using Livescope, and I'll always ask them hey, have you seen fish behavior where you hit them with the beam and they just shoot off? And the majority of the guys say, yeah, there's plenty of times when I'll hit a fish and it moves out of the beam, and then they'll hit the fish again and it moves out of the beam. You can tell that some of the fish already have some type of whereabouts of whatever this weird thing is not the deal. So there's already some sort of evidence of that already happening, and we're not even that far into Livescope technology, and there might be some type of implication that it might be hurting the fishing in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, for a guy like me that doesn't use Livescope it probably doesn't really affect me that much because I'm a huge believer in not using electronics when I'm actually fishing. The only time I have my side scan on is basically when I want to find out if there's a rock pile or a tree or something. But for the most part, I fish with my graphs turned off so I can be as stealthy as possible, because in my own head, I think it matters whether or not those fish can hear that pinging or feel that beam. And I feel like it might affect their brain thinking like, something's wrong, but there's this fish thing here. I think it's fake, but it looks real. Like, but there's something weird going on, and they might just shut down and be very hesitant. That's just how it is in my mind. I don't know if it's true or not. I wish I could tell you, but that's just how it works in my mind, and I've had confidence in doing that. So, Livescope and swimbaits, like, I'm honestly curious on if guys right now, they're having incredible success using Livescope and scoping fish with the glide bait. I think the glide bait is one of the best baits to use for Livescope because the return of the lure is so prominent. You could really see exactly what it's doing down there. And a huge plus is that you're able to learn fish behavior on how to work a glide bait, first of all, because getting a fish to eat a glide bait can be really hard, especially if they're following the bait. So when you're able to watch that fish down there and you still have a lot of real estate, as in like line out, you can start playing around like, all right, do they want it faster, or do they want like a 1 1 1, or do they want a 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1, and then they bite it. So I think that's a great way to just figure out what are the fish committing to at that time of day or that month or just that lake in general, if they like a certain retrieve better than others. Now, another negative, of course, is obviously just the pressure that it's going to be putting on fish. I've seen a lot of guys where they'll be scoping a fish and the fish just is not really, it's not active, it doesn't want to feed. But guys, what they can do is, now that they can see that fish on scope, is they'll just keep casting at that fish. And because they can see it technically, it's kind of like when you see a follower for the first time, you're like, oh, I just had a follower. You throw back out there and it'll follow it again. And then you throw it out again and you might follow it for a little bit, but turn off. And then you keep casting on it, hoping that fish will eventually bite. But you're just teaching that fish to like, all right, I followed this enough times to know like that whatever thing that thing is, it's fake. It leads to that boat thing, and that's danger. And I feel like it's the same thing happening with Livescope. If you're fishing for fish and they're just not actively feeding, and you just keep throwing a lure at them, then it might be detrimental to guys that fish Livescope as well as just fish swim baits in general. Because if those fish see that constantly over and over and over again, then they're gonna finally, I think, be like, if the bait moves like this or if it does something weird like this, it's most likely fake. So that was just something I observed out on the water. I just watched this guy literally make maybe 20 or 25 casts on a fish that I knew was there, and I was like, dang, like the fish is there, it's just not active at all, but he keeps throwing a lure at it over and over again. I think he's just making that fish much smarter to lures and as well as forward facing. Now, what guys obviously like Ben Milliken has done with swimbait fishing in tournaments has been unbelievable. It's something that a lot of guys have always wanted to do, which was implementing big swimbaits in a tournament setting to hopefully cash big checks. And he's done it very successfully. I think he's going to be on the Elite Series now, which is absolutely insane. And so his ability to use Livescope and catch those fish on the glide baits and sinking them down, it has definitely revolutionized how people view glide bait fishing. I mean, glide baits have become very much more popular to just a normal guy if he has Livescope, because now he can see where the bait's doing, see if he wants to sink it down to the fish. And guys have had a lot of success doing that because of what Milliken has kind of brought to the table. And he's really just been one of the best guys that I've ever seen do it. But what's crazy is it's a small thing, but it seems like a lot of the glide bait makers now is they are making glide baits that sink a little bit faster than what I always prefer for those guys that are using Livescope. So there might be a bait out on the market that I think is really cool, but the bait maker only makes them in a quote unquote slow sink, but it actually sinks pretty fast, so guys can fish it on Livescope. And for me, a guy that doesn't have Livescope, and I like to fish my baits, my glide baits in general, a little bit higher in the water column, and I want it to like slow and be wide gliding and not sink super fast, I won't be able to pick up that bait. So there's small like things that I'm seeing that are making changes in the swim bait world. I'm definitely seeing a lot more swim bait guys than how it was before. A lot of swim bait guys are having more success than what they've done before as well with the use of Livescope. So it's this yin and yang where, you know, is Livescope very helpful? Absolutely. Is Livescope detrimental to just the fishing pressure? Quite possibly. And we'll just have to see in 5 or 10 years to see if Livescope is still like, you're able to catch giant bass consistently on Livescope on some of these higher pressure bodies of water. So that's kind of my take on Livescope. I think it's an incredible tool. I mean, something that I could have never have imagined when I was bass fishing back, you know, 10, 15 years ago. I never would have thought that Livescope would have been an option. I just remember my first graph that I ever had was a hummingbird piranha 2D. I mean, that's what we had, and I was like, man, this thing is sick. We can see the depth that we're in and the water temperature. That's crazy. But to now see that there's graphs of where you can see live feed of exactly what the fish are doing, it's honestly unbelievable. And it's crazy to think, where will it go from here? I mean, I remember when SideScan came out, I'm like, dude, nothing beats SideScan. And then you had like Humminbird 360, that was crazy as well, and some of the other ones. But then it made this massive jump to Livescope, and it's like, well, in life, technology has always just kept advancing, so where is it going to go from here? Who knows? What do you guys think about Livescope? Leave a comment down below. If you hate it, please don't put too much negativity down there. If you love it, you can post whatever. But I'm just curious on what the general audience of people is like. Is it a 50-50 split? Is there 70% of people love it, 30% hate it? Like, I've seen a bunch of drama online about it, and I'm just curious on it. But that's kind of my overall thoughts with Livescope and swim baits. I think they pair very, very well together, but I'm curious on if it's an everlasting couple or if there's going to be a massive divorce down the line. Other than that, thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, go out there and chase your dreams.